On Christmas morning in the year 800, the city of Rome holds its breath. Inside St. Peter's Basilica, 10,000 candles push back the dark. The air is thick with frankincense, sweet and heavy, catching in your throat. You can feel the cold, even through the press of bodies, a deep stone cold that no fire quite reaches. The congregation is packed shoulder to shoulder, bishops and nobles and soldiers, all of them watching the altar where Pope Leo III stands waiting. And then he walks in. He is not young anymore. His hair is grey, his face weathered by decades of war and politics and the particular exhaustion of ruling men who do not want to be ruled. He moves through the basilica like a man who has earned every step. He kneels to pray. The congregation watches in silence. And then Pope Leo lifts the crown. What happens next stops everyone cold. The congregation erupts. Not polite applause. Not a formal response. A roar. Carolus Augustus, they cry. Crowned by God. Great and peace-giving Emperor of the Romans. The words boom off the ancient stone walls. They have not used that acclamation in over 300 years. Not since the last Western Roman emperor was quietly removed from power and the title was simply allowed to die. Tonight it lives again. In that single moment, a Germanic warlord from the Rhine frontier becomes the first emperor of the Western world since Rome fell. It is one of the most consequential events in the history of Europe, and almost nobody in that basilica fully grasps what it means yet. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's begin. Now cut the candles, cut the incense, cut the roar. What you have instead is this: a grey morning along the Rhine. The river is half frozen, moving slowly. Black water pushing against shelves of ice at the edges. Reed marshes stretch out flat in every direction. The wind carries the smell of mud and wet wood and animal dung. Somewhere in the distance, behind a screen of bare winter trees, a cluster of timber longhouses sits low against the ground, their thatch roofs dark with frost. Smoke rises from a single roof hole into a sky the color of iron. This is where it started, not in Rome, not in a palace. Here, among people the Romans could barely be bothered to name. The word the Romans eventually settled on was Franci. Where it came from, nobody is entirely sure. Some said it meant fierce. A Roman orator named Eumenius once addressed a group of Frankish prisoners being led to their execution in the city of Trier, and his words were not kind. "Where now is that ferocity of yours?" he asked them. "Where is that ever untrustworthy fickleness?" He was talking to men about to die, and still he felt the need to explain why they deserved it. That tells you everything about how Rome saw these people. Others connected the name to an old Germanic word for javelin, a short throwing weapon, iron-headed, built for the first chaotic seconds of a fight, the kind of weapon you carry when you expect violence to find you before you find it. That feels right too. What we know for certain is this: the name Franks appears in the historical record during the 3rd century, during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period when the Roman Empire nearly tore itself apart. Emperors rose and fell like seasons. the Rhine frontier buckled, and out of the chaos along the lower Rhine, several Germanic tribes began to act together, raid together, sometimes be described together under this single new collective name: the Bructeri, the Chamavi, the Chatuari. These were real peoples with their own histories, their own territories, their own gods. They had been living across the Rhine from Rome for centuries under various names inside what Rome called Germania Inferior. But during the crisis, something changed. The old tribal identities began to blur at the edges. A new identity began to form, not planned, not declared, just happening the way all real change happens, through pressure and proximity and shared necessity. Imagine what the Rhine frontier looked like in those years. On the Roman side, garrison towns, stone walls, roads that ran straight as ambition. Soldiers from all over the empire, some of them Germanic themselves, standing watch along a border that was always one bad night away from disaster. On the other side, the timber longhouses, the reed marshes, the winter mud. But also something else. Farmsteads that traded with Rome. Tribal leaders who wore Roman belt fittings and drank from Roman cups. A frontier that was never as clean as Rome pretended. By the 250-60s, the men the Romans were calling Germani, or simply barbarians, were moving. They crossed the Rhine and pushed into Gaul. Some of them reached Spain, a group that the 4th century writer Aurelius Victor specifically identified as Franks got hold of ships on the Spanish coast and raided North Africa. Think about that. These supposed forest people from the Rhine marshes were sailing the Mediterranean. They were not what Rome thought they were, and Rome was starting to notice. A panegyric written in the year 291, one of the first truly reliable sources to use the word Frank, describes the Roman Emperor Maximian forcing a Frankish king named Genobod to become a Roman client. Just 2 years later, Constantius Chlorus, father of Constantine the Great, fought Frankish groups who had settled inside the empire along the Rhine-Meuse-Scheldt delta. His victory was documented with a new Latin phrase, nationes Francia, the nations of the Franks, plural, because even Rome had stopped pretending this was one simple tribe. In 306, Constantine the Great executed 2 Frankish kings named Ascaric and Merogisus, then launched a devastating raid on the Bructeri as a warning to the rest. He built a bridge over the Rhine at Cologne just to make the point. A bridge says something. It says, I can come to you whenever I want. It says this river is not your protection anymore. But here is the thing about the Franks. Every time Rome pushed them back, they returned, not in the same form, not with the same leaders, but always back. Because the Rhine was not a wall. It was a meeting place. And the Franks had learned over generations how to work both sides of it. By the mid-4th century, Frankish soldiers were not just raiding the empire. They were running it. 4 Franks served as commanders-in-chief of the Roman imperial army during the reign of the Valentinian dynasty. One of them, a man named Arbogast, became so powerful that he placed his own candidate on the imperial throne. He crossed the Rhine personally, plundered the lands of the Bructeri and the Chamavi, and then marched back into the empire to fight a civil war. When his candidate was defeated and executed at the Battle of the Frigidus in 394, Arbogast did not wait to be captured. He walked out alone and fell on his sword. A Frankish general, dying like a Roman. That is the entanglement Rome never fully solved. You recruit these men because they fight brilliantly. You promote them because they are loyal. Until they are not, you give them power because the empire needs them. And then you discover the empire cannot take that power back. In 358, a Roman commander named Julian, not yet an emperor, struck fast against a Frankish people called the Salians, who had been settling inside Roman territory along the Rhine Delta. He needed grain shipments coming up the river from Britain to pass safely. He did not want to keep paying the tribes to allow it, so he attacked. He won. He took hostages and cattle and children. And then he did something that tells you exactly where history was heading. He authorized the Salians to keep the lands they had already settled. He made them Roman clients. He folded them into the imperial system. He turned raiders into defenders. Within a generation, Frankish soldiers were guarding the very frontier their fathers had crossed as enemies. And when the Rhine finally broke in 406, when a massive wave of Alans and Vandals from Eastern Europe tried to pour into Gaul, it was the Franks who stood in their way. They killed one of the Alan kings outright. They bled in Rome's name. Rome barely said thank you. That is the story of the early Franks. Not a story of simple barbarians hammering at a civilized wall. A story of people living in the gap between two worlds, learning both, belonging fully to neither. They were raiders and soldiers, clients and kings, pagans who wore Roman belt buckles, and tribesmen who commanded Roman armies. They were fierce, yes. Eumenius was not entirely wrong about that. But fierce is not the same as simple. These were people building something, even if they did not yet have a name for what it was. Rome had a word for peoples like these. Barbarian. It was meant to end the conversation. Instead, it only delayed it, because one of these tribal chieftains, in one of these mud-floored halls, was about to make a decision that would change everything. And Rome would never see it coming. The trees give way, and Clovis is already there. No warning, no herald, no polite demand for surrender. His war band comes through the forest at a run, shields up, spears leveled, and the men on the other side barely have time to form a line before it is over. This is how he works. This is who he is. Clovis, king of the Salian Franks, does not negotiate with men he has already decided to destroy. He arrives, and then it is done. He is somewhere around 15 or 16 years old when he inherits his father's small kingdom. Think about that. A teenager ruling a strip of territory between the Somme and the Rhine, surrounded on every side by people who would happily watch him fail. To the south, the ghost of Rome still walks the earth in the form of a Roman administrator named Syagrius, holding the last patch of imperial territory in Gaul. To the southwest, the Visigoths control a vast kingdom stretching from the Loire to Spain. To the east, the Burgundians press against his borders. And within his own world, a dozen Frankish chieftains consider themselves his equals. Some of them are his cousins. Several of them are his uncles. He will solve every single one of these problems the same way. But that comes later. First, there is Syagrius. Rome had been dying in the west for decades. Everyone knew it. The last Western emperor had been deposed in 476, just 10 years before Clovis moves against Syagrius. But Syagrius has kept his little domain alive through sheer stubbornness, holding the city of Soissons, as if the empire might still come back for it. He calls himself the King of the Romans. He administers Roman law. He collects Roman taxes. He is, in every practical sense, a man standing in a room whose walls have already been demolished, insisting the house is still standing. Clovis does not argue with him. He marches. 486. The air smells of turned earth and horse sweat as the Frankish forces close on Soissons. Syagrius does not wait for a siege. He meets them in the field, and he loses. He loses so completely and so quickly that he flees immediately, running south to the court of the Visigoth king Alaric II, throwing himself on the mercy of a man who has every reason to be nervous about Clovis himself. Clovis sends a message to Alaric. Simple, direct, hand him over or face war. Alaric hands him over. Syagrius is returned to Frankish custody, and Clovis has him quietly executed. Just like that, the last Roman territory in Gaul belongs to a Frankish king. Chapter 1 promised you that Rome would never see the Franks coming. Here is the moment, not a thunderous final battle, not a dramatic last stand. A middle-aged Roman bureaucrat running for his life through the forest, begging a Visigoth for help that would not save him. The Roman world in Gaul does not end with a crash. It ends with a man who cannot find a single ally willing to die for what he represents. Clovis is not done. He is barely started. The rival Frankish chieftains fall one by one, some in battle, some through treachery so precise it reads like a man working through a list. He invites a rival king to a meeting and has him killed. He turns one Frankish lord against another, then eliminates them both. Gregory of Tours, the bishop who will write all this down a century later, records Clovis himself saying near the end of his life that he has no relatives left, that he stands alone. Gregory adds carefully that Clovis said this not out of grief. He said it because he was looking for more relatives he might have missed. There is a coldness to this man that the sources do not bother to hide. He kills efficiently. He kills family. He kills Emily. He might become a problem before they become one. And yet, this same man is about to make a decision driven, at least in part, by something his wife whispers to him in the dark. Her name is Clotilda. She is a Burgundian princess, Catholic in a court full of Arians and pagans, and she has been working on her husband from the moment they married. Understand what she is up against. The Franks are pagan. Their gods are the old Germanic gods, the ones Gregory of Tours politely translates as Jupiter and Mercury. These are war gods, storm gods, gods for a people who measure the world in blade lengths and cattle counts. Clotilda is asking Clovis to trade them for a god who was executed by a Roman governor. She knows exactly how that sounds. She tries anyway. She tries through argument and through example and through sheer persistence, and Clovis resists. When their first son is born, Clotilda has the child baptized without her husband's permission. The infant dies shortly after. Clovis's response is not grief. His jaw tightens, and he looks at her and says, in words Gregory preserves for us, that if the child had been dedicated to his gods, the boy would still be alive. Clotilda has their second son baptized without asking either. That child falls desperately ill. Clovis waits. The boy survives, but Clovis does not change his mind. He is not a man who changes his mind because of arguments. He changes it on a battlefield. Around 496, the Alemanni push hard across the Rhine. They are not raiders. They come in force, pressing into Frankish territory, with the intention of staying. Clovis meets them at a place called Tolbiac. The fight is brutal and long, and at some point the Frankish line begins to crack. Men who had never broken before are stepping back. The Alemanni press forward. The smell of blood and churned mud fills everything, and the sound, above the clash of iron, is the sound of a battle turning the wrong way. Clovis does something he has never done before. He looks up. What happens next? We have only from Gregory of Tours, written generations later, but the account has the texture of something that was told and retold, passed down through the men who were there and their sons and their grandsons. Clovis makes a vow. He calls out to the god of Clotilde. He says in words Gregory records, that if this god gives him victory today, he will believe and be baptized. He is not asking for a sign. He is offering a deal. He is negotiating with the divine the same way he negotiates with rival chieftains. And the Alemanni break. Their king is killed. The army collapses. The men who had been pushing the Franks back are suddenly running, and Clovis stands in the middle of a battlefield that has just reversed itself, and the question he now has to answer is whether he actually meant what he said. He goes home. He tells Clotilde. She goes immediately to Bishop Remigius of Reims, the most powerful churchman in Gaul, and the preparations begin. But it is not fast. Clovis takes time. He consults his chieftains. He tells them what he is considering and asks what they think. This matters. A Frankish king does not rule alone. His warriors have a voice. And here, in this moment, you see the full complexity of this man. He has already made a private vow on a battlefield, but he does not act on it until he knows his people will follow. Is that faith, or is that politics? Hold that question. It does not have a clean answer. On Christmas Day, the exact year still debated, but somewhere around 496 to 508, Clovis walks into a small church near what will later become the Abbey of Saint Remy in Reims. The building is hung with white linen. Candles burn along every wall. The air is thick with incense and beeswax, a smell utterly foreign to a man raised in smoky timber halls. Thousands of his warriors have already been baptized. The city, Gregory tells us, rang with the sound of celebration, with singing and the sound of feet on stone floors, a whole people crossing a threshold together. Clovis walks to the font. Remigius stands over him, and the bishop's words come down to us across 1,500 years, worn smooth by repetition, but still carrying their original edge. Bow your head, proud Sicumbrian. Worship what you have burned. Burn what you have worshipped. The water closes over the king of the Franks. When he comes up, everything has changed, not just for him, for the shape of the Western world. Here is what his baptism actually does in practical terms. Every other Germanic king in the West has converted to Arian Christianity, the version that was declared a heresy at the Council of Nicaea in 325. The Visigoths are Arian. The Burgundians are Arian. The Vendelians are Arian. The Vandals are Arian. Clovis converts to Roman Catholic Christianity, the faith of the Gallo-Roman population he now rules, the faith of the bishops who control the administrative machinery of every city in Gaul. In one act, he separates himself from every rival king and aligns himself with the most powerful institutional network in the Western world. The Church does not miss what this means. The bishops of Gaul write to him. They celebrate him. They call him a new Constantine. They open their cities to him when he moves against the Visigoths in 507, driving them out of southern Gaul. The Catholic population does not resist. They help. The Gallo-Roman aristocracy, men who had served Rome and then watched Rome dissolve, now have a king they can believe in. Not because he is Roman, because he is Catholic. But there is a cost. Bernard Bachrach, the historian, argues that the conversion alienated many of the old Frankish sub-kings, the pagan lords who had followed Clovis because he was one of them. He had burned what they worshipped. He had asked them to follow him into a foreign faith, and some of them never fully forgave it. The military position of the Franks, Bachrach suggests, actually weakened for a time in the years immediately after the baptism. Clovis paid that price and kept moving. He had calculated that the gain outweighed the loss. He was right. But the calculation itself tells you something. When he dies in 511, Clovis is buried with Clotilda in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Paris, the church that will later bear the name of Saint Genevieve. He has conquered nearly all of Gaul. He has eliminated his rivals. He has bound his kingdom to the most durable institution in the Western world. He has transformed a collection of tribal warbands into something that is beginning, just beginning, to look like a kingdom. Was any of it genuine? Did he believe, standing in that water? Or was he simply closing a deal? Look at the man's whole life. He killed his cousins. He executed Syagrius without a trial. He lied to allies and murdered them at dinner tables. He was capable of absolutely anything. And yet, he kept the promise. He was baptized. He built churches. He called church councils. He never went back. Maybe both things are true. Maybe the most terrifying kind of faith is the kind that lives inside a man who is also perfectly capable of everything else. Bishop Remigius told him to bow his head, and he did. Clovis came up from those waters the most powerful man in the Western world, but he had just made a promise to a church, to a god, to a new idea of what a king could be, and that promise, as his descendants would discover, was one that could never fully be kept. The soil gives way slowly. That is always how it happens. A brushstroke, a pause, another brushstroke, and then the light catches something that has not seen sunlight in 14 centuries. Gold, deep red garnet set into gold cloisonne. The kind of craftsmanship that takes months and a steady hand and a patron wealthy enough to wait. A sword hilt, a buckle, a brooch the size of a man's palm, glittering like it was made yesterday. The archaeologists lean closer. They are looking at the burial goods of a Merovingian noble, a man or woman of the Frankish ruling class, someone who lived and feasted and prayed and fought in the world that Clovis built. And what a world it was. Stone churches rising over cities that Rome had built and the Franks had inherited. Gold coins stamped with royal faces. Manuscripts copied by candlelight in monasteries that stretched from the Rhine to the Atlantic coast. Craftsmen who worked glass and iron and precious metal with a skill that would make you stop and stare. This was not a dark age. Not here. Not here. This was a civilization. And Clovis handed it to his 4 sons. Equally, that was the Frankish way. A father's kingdom was his property, and property got divided. Theodoric received the northeast. Clodomeric took the middle territories around Orleans. Childebert ruled Paris and the northwest. Clotaire held the southwest. 4 kings, 1 kingdom, cut into 4. You already feel it, don't you? the way a crack sounds before the break. Within 15 years of Clovis dying in 511, the killing had started. Clodoma died in battle in 524, fighting the Burgundians. He left 3 young sons. His brothers, Childebert and Slotterbert, and Schlotter invited those boys to court. They told their sister Clotilde, the widow of Clovis, the Christian queen who had prayed her husband into the baptismal font, that they wanted to raise the children as princes. Clotilde believed them. She had no reason not to. They were family. Childebert and Schlotter murdered 2 of the boys with their own hands. The third escaped to a monastery. He became a monk and eventually a saint. His name was Claude. The French still call the town west of Paris after him, Saint Claude, a saint made from a murdered child. That is the texture of what came next. The divisions hardened into kingdoms with names. Austrasia in the east, centered on the Rhine Valley, the old Germanic heartland. Neustria in the northwest, more Romanized, more connected to the church hierarchies of Old Gaul. Burgundy in the southeast, Aquitaine in the south. They were ruled by Merovingians. They were also always at war with each other. Territory changed hands. Kings died young, sometimes in battle, sometimes in bed, sometimes in bed, sometimes in circumstances that nobody at court wanted to explain too carefully. And then, in 567, something happened that turned a dynasty's self-destruction into something almost operatic in its violence. A woman named Brunhilde arrived in Austrasia from Visigothic Spain to marry the Austrasian king Sigebert. She was educated, politically sharp, and Catholic. Her sister Galswintha traveled west to marry Sigebert's brother Chilperic, king of Neustria. Chilperic already had a mistress. Her name was Fredegund. She was a servant woman, low-born, brilliant, and absolutely without mercy. Within a year of Galswintha's arrival in Neustria, she was dead, strangled in her bed. Chilperic married Fredegund almost immediately. Nobody was subtle about what had happened. Brunhilde, grieving her sister, looked across the border at Neustria and made a decision that would define the next 40 years of Frankish history. She would not forgive. She would not forget. She would fight. What followed was not a war. It was something older and colder than a war. It was a blood feud conducted at the level of kingdoms. Sigebert was assassinated in 575, almost certainly on Fredegund's orders. 2 killers with poisoned blades sent into his tent during a moment of triumph. Brunhilde was captured. Her young son Childebert II was smuggled out of the palace by loyal nobles and crowned king of Austrasia. Brunhilde spent years in captivity in Neustria, then escaped, then spent decades ruling as regent for her son, and later her grandsons, fighting Fredegund and then fighting Fredegund's son, Schlotter II, after Fredegund finally died in 597. Fredegund, Brunhilde, 2 women, one low-born and one royal, both ferociously intelligent, both willing to do things that made the men around them flinch. They are not a footnote. They are the story. Because while Frankish kings stabbed each other and died young and divided their kingdoms and watched their sons divide them again, these 2 women kept the machine running. They negotiated. They raised armies. They made alliances with bishops. They played the church like an instrument. That last part matters, because the church was watching all of this. The bishops of Gaul had made that bargain with Clovis, Catholic faith in exchange for royal protection and patronage. They had kept their end. Churches built. Councils convened. Heretics, specifically the Arian Visigoths, defeated partly because of Frankish military force. But now they looked at the Merovingian dynasty and saw something that made them deeply uneasy. Not wickedness, not heresy. Something worse. Incompetence, exhaustion, a bloodline thinning out. The Merovingian kings had always claimed something almost sacred about their long hair. The long-haired kings, people called them. The hair was a sign of power, of divine favor, of royal legitimacy. To cut a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of his kingship without killing him. It happened to deposed rivals regularly. But you cannot cut your way to competence. And by the later 7th century, the kings were coming to the throne younger and younger, reigning shorter and shorter, dying or being set aside before they could build anything. Into that vacuum stepped a new kind of official, the mayor of the palace. The title sounds like a domestic servant. It was not. The mayor of the palace was the chief administrator of the royal household, which meant in practice he controlled access to the king, controlled the royal treasury, commanded the military, and made the decisions. The king attended ceremonies. The mayor of the palace governed, and as the kings grew weaker, the mayors grew stronger, until the arrangement stopped being a convenience and became the actual structure of power. The Frankish nobility noticed. The church noticed. Everyone noticed. What nobody quite said out loud, not yet, was the obvious thing, that the man doing the work of a king should perhaps be king. Different noble families competed for the mayoral position in different kingdoms, the way families in later centuries would compete for prime ministerships or chancellorships. In Austrasia, one family kept winning that competition. They traced their lineage back to a bishop of Metz named Arnulf and to a nobleman named Pepin of Landen. The family is hard to name cleanly in this period because historians have given them different labels at different times, but the name that will stick, the name that history remembers, is Carolingian, from Carolus. Charles, a name the family would make into one of the most resonant words in Western history. Brunhilde's story ended badly. In 613, Clotaire II, Fredegund's son, finally united the Frankish kingdoms by force. He captured Brunhilde, who was in her 60s by then, and executed her in a way designed to humiliate as much as destroy. She was accused of causing the deaths of 10 Frankish kings. She was paraded before the army on a camel. Then she was tied to wild horses and torn apart. Clotaire watched. Whatever you think of Brunhilde, whatever she actually did, she had spent 40 years holding Austrasia together. She had kept the church close. She had kept the borders intact. And she died on the orders of a king who owed his throne partly to a Carolingian mayor of the palace who had helped him win. The pattern was set. The Merovingian kings would continue to reign. They would appear at festivals and receive ambassadors and issue documents with their names on them, but the hands that actually held Francia together were elsewhere. The Roi Fainéants, people would eventually call them. The do-nothing kings. It is not entirely fair. Some of them tried. But trying was no longer enough, and the institution around them had already moved on. By the end of the 7th century, a Merovingian king's ceremonial transport was an ox cart. Not a horse, not a war stallion. An ox cart, slow and heavy, pulled through cheering crowds who knew perfectly well that the man sitting in it was a symbol and nothing more. The real power stood somewhere nearby, dressed in less gold, carrying more weight. That man answered to the name Carolingian. But to understand how that family finally took the crown for themselves, you have to understand the moment that justified everything. The moment when the fate of Europe hung on a single battle line, and the man who held that line was not a king. He was a mayor of the palace, and his name was Charles. Charles, who would earn a surname that told you exactly what he did. Charles the Hammer, and the blow he was about to strike would change the world. The ships come first, dozens of them, cutting across the Strait of Gibraltar in the summer heat of 711. On the northern shore, the Visigothic kingdom of Spain watches and does nothing useful. It is already fracturing from within, torn apart by a succession crisis that left half the nobility willing to invite anyone in if it meant their rival lost. Tariq ibn Ziyad lands with roughly 7,000 men. Within weeks, he has more. Within months, he has everything. Think about that speed. An entire kingdom gone. The Visigoths had ruled Iberia for 2 centuries. They had cities, cathedrals, laws, armies, and the Umayyad forces moved through them like fire through dry grass. Roderick, the Visigothic king, died at the Battle of Guadalete in July of 711. His army collapsed around him. His capital, Toledo, fell shortly after. By 718, the Umayyad Caliphate controlled nearly all of the Iberian Peninsula. What had taken the Visigoths generations to build had been swept away in 7 years. The advance did not stop there. North of the Pyrenees lay a region the Romans had called Septimania. Then came Aquitaine. Then, beyond that, the heartland of Francia itself. The Umayyad forces were not raiding. They were moving with the logic of conquest, probing for weakness, feeding the campaign as they went. In 720, they took Narbonne. In 721, they pushed toward Toulouse. Duke Odo of Aquitaine stopped them there, at least temporarily. But Odo was not strong enough to hold forever, and everyone knew it. The smell of burning followed the advance north, not the clean smoke of campfires, the thick, oily black smoke of cities put to the torch, of granaries emptied and barns destroyed. The Umayyad commander Abd al-Rahman ibn Abdullah al-Ghafiqi was no savage. He was a capable administrator and a serious military mind. But war feeds on territory, and his army needed to feed. In 732, Abd al-Rahman crossed the Pyrenees again with a force that contemporary sources describe in numbers so large historians have argued about them ever since. The precise count does not matter. What matters is what Odo of Aquitaine felt when he saw them coming. He had already lost Bordeaux. His army had been smashed on the banks of the Garonne. He rode north to the one man who might still be able to help him, the man he had spent years fighting, the man he had called an enemy as recently as the year before. He rode to Charles. Charles Martel had not come to power gently. His father, Pippin of Herstal, had been the dominant mayor of the palace in Austrasia, and when Pippin died in 700, mayor of the palace in Austrasia, and when Pippin died in 714, the succession shattered. Pippin's widow, Pietrude, tried to rule as regent through a young grandson. She had Charles, Pippin's illegitimate son by another woman, thrown into prison. She thought that would end it. It did not end it. Charles escaped, or was freed. The sources are not clear on which. What is clear is that within a few years, he had fought his way back from nothing defeated his rivals in battle after battle, and seized control of the mayoralty through sheer, grinding military force. He imprisoned the legitimate Merovingian heir. He sidelined his own half-brothers. He put a king on the Frankish throne, the right kind of king, the manageable kind, and then he turned to the actual work of holding a fractured kingdom together. By 732, Charles had been consolidating Frankish power for nearly 2 decades. He had fought the Saxons to the northeast. He had pushed into Bavaria. He had spent years hammering the nobility of Neustria into something resembling loyalty. His soldiers knew the sound of his voice on a battlefield. They knew what he expected and what he gave in return. He gave them victory, consistently, almost supernaturally. He gave them victory. When Odo arrived, hat in hand, asking for help against the force that had just burned Bordeaux, Charles looked at the man who had spent years defying him. Then he agreed to march. Picture the Frankish army assembling in the autumn of 732. The air carries the first cold edge of October. The men's breath shows faintly in the morning. Their boots are heavy with mud from weeks of marching south through Aquitaine. These are not light cavalrymen. They are heavy infantry, trained to stand, to hold, to form a wall of shields and muscle and iron that does not move until it is ready to move. Charles had spent years shaping them into exactly this. A hammer, waiting for something to strike. They found Abd al-Rahman somewhere between Tours and Poitiers. The exact location is still debated. What is not debated is what happened when the two forces met. The Umayyad cavalry charged. They had broken armies this way before, sweeping forward in fast fluid waves that turned flanks and shattered formations before infantry could respond. It had worked in Spain. It had worked at the Garonne. Against a lesser commander and a lesser army, it would have worked here too. Charles held his line. The Frankish infantry locked shields and absorbed the charge. Then they absorbed another. The cavalry broke against them like water against stone. Hours passed. The charges came again and again. The men holding that line could feel it in their legs, that deep bone ache of standing under repeated impact, the vibration traveling up through the soles of their feet every time a wave of horses hit the shields in front of them. They did not break. Then word moved through the Umayyad camp that their baggage train was under attack. Some accounts say Frankish scouts had circled around. Some say the army itself began to fragment, men pulling back to protect the plunder they had accumulated across months of campaign. Whatever the cause, the formation began to loosen. Abd al-Rahman rode forward to rally his men. He did not come back from that ride. The Umayyad commander died in the fighting, killed by Frankish soldiers in the chaos of a collapsing charge. And when the commander falls, the calculation changes. The army did not rout. It pulled back in reasonable order, made camp, and then in the night simply left. When Frankish scouts moved forward at dawn, they found an empty field, tents still standing, fires still smoldering, the smell of cold ash and horse dung, and the particular silence of a place where thousands of men had been and were no longer. Charles walked through that empty camp and said nothing that was recorded. The Christian world called it a miracle. Chroniclers reached for the largest language they had. The battle would eventually give Charles his surname, Martel, the hammer, though the name may not have attached to him until after his death. It did not matter. The meaning was clear. He had struck, and the blow had held. But here is the thing about Tours that the miracle language tends to obscure. The Umayyad advance into Frankish territory was already stretched. Abd al-Rahman was operating at the far edge of a supply line that ran all the way back to Iberia. A defeat hurt him badly. A victory might not have held either. What Charles did at Tours was not simply stop an army. He demonstrated conclusively and permanently that the Frankish military machine under his command was something the Umayyad forces could not simply roll over. That demonstration mattered for decades. Charles spent the next years pressing the advantage. He took Narbonne. Eventually, he pushed the Umayyad presence back toward the Pyrenees. He did not liberate Iberia. That was a project for other centuries and other people. But he secured the northern frontier. He made clear where Christian Europe ended and where the cost of crossing it would become prohibitive. And he did all of this without a crown. That is the uncomfortable fact sitting at the center of Charles Martel's story. He ruled Francia. Every duke, every bishop, every petty lord in the kingdom answered to him or suffered for refusing. He commanded armies, distributed land, appointed clergy, made war and peace according to his own judgment. He did everything a king does. He simply did not use the word. For a time, after 737, he did not even bother to put a Merovingian on the throne. The last king had died, and Charles left the position vacant for 4 years. No one powerful enough objected. That silence told you everything about where the real authority lived. He died in 741. Not in battle. In his bed, at his palace at Chiesi, in October. He had ruled for nearly 30 years, and he had spent most of them in motion, moving from one crisis to the next with the relentless forward energy of a man who knew that the moment he stopped, everything he had built might unravel. His body was taken to the Basilica of Saint Denis, the burial church of Frankish royalty, and laid there among kings whose names had already begun to fade. He divided his domains between his 2 sons, as Franks always did, because dividing the inheritance was simply what you did, even when it made no strategic sense, even when you had watched it tear kingdoms apart before. One son was named Carloman, the other was named Pippin. Carloman was serious and devout, the kind of man who would eventually walk away from power entirely to become a monk, which he did. Pippin was something else. Shorter than his father, they said, but built with the same density of purpose. He had watched Charles hold a kingdom together without a crown and had drawn his own conclusions about what was possible. Pippin had a son who would be called in time Charles the Great. Charlemagne. The age of Martel was over. The mechanism was in motion. But one obstacle remained, one final, almost absurd obstacle. A king with no power sitting in an ox cart, wearing a crown that no longer meant anything, being wheeled through crowds who cheered for a symbol while the real business of the kingdom happened elsewhere. Someone was going to have to look that man in the face and tell him it was finished. Someone was going to have to take the crown off his head and find a way to make it look like God's will rather than naked ambition. Pippin was already thinking about how to do it. The cells smelled of cold stone and tallow smoke. A single candle, a wooden bench, and a man sitting very still, running his hands over his own skull, feeling the absence of something he had carried his entire life. Childeric III had been king of the Franks, not in any real sense, not in the sense that mattered, not in the sense of armies and decisions and the smell of a battlefield at dawn. But he had worn the title. He had ridden in the ox cart through cheering crowds, his long golden hair flowing behind him like a banner, because among the Merovingians The hair was the power. The hair was the bloodline made visible. Cut it, and you cut the king away from God's favor. Everyone knew that. Pippin knew it too, which is why, when the barber's blade came down in the autumn of 751, it wasn't cruelty. It was a statement. Childeric didn't die. That was the mercy of the new order. Or at least, that's what Pippin needed people to believe. The last Merovingian was simply, quietly, permanently erased. Tonsured like a monk, sent to a monastery at Saint-Bertin. The crown didn't need to be seized, it just needed to be made available. But here is the thing Pippin understood that his father Charles never quite had to reckon with. Charles Martel had held everything together through sheer force, hammer blows, the will of a man who moved faster than his enemies could think. That worked for one lifetime. It doesn't build a dynasty. A dynasty needs something else. It needs the feeling that God approves. And for that, Pippin needed a priest with the right answer to the right question. The question he sent to Rome in 751 was almost elegant in its simplicity. He dispatched envoys to Pope Zachary with a single query: in the kingdom of the Franks, who should rightfully be called king? The man who holds all the power, or the man who merely bears the title? It sounds philosophical. It was a knife. Pippin already knew what he intended to do. He just needed someone with the authority of heaven to tell him it was permitted. Pope Zachary gave him exactly that. The man who holds the power, the Pope replied, should hold the name. It was a sentence that changed the world, because what Zachary had done, whether he fully grasped it in that moment or not, was declare that legitimate rulership came not from blood alone, not from ancient lineage, not from the length of a man's hair, but from the exercise of real governance and from the blessing of the church. Pippin folded that answer like a sealed letter and carried it into the future. Saint Boniface, the great English missionary who had spent decades converting the Germanic peoples east of the Rhine, anointed Pippin as King of the Franks. The ceremony was extraordinary, not because kings had never been crowned before, but because no Frankish king had ever been consecrated by a Christian bishop. The oil on Pippin's forehead wasn't just ritual. It was a new kind of claim. God had chosen this man. The church had confirmed it. The bloodline of the Merovingians, that ancient magic of long hair and royal ancestry, was finished. Something else had replaced it, something that would prove far more durable. Pippin was short. His contemporaries noted it, sometimes with the faint edge of mockery that short men learn to recognize early. But he stood in that moment with the weight of anointing on him, and the crowd before him, and whatever they thought about his height, nobody laughed. You don't laugh at a man the church has just handed to God. But the deal wasn't finished. It had only just begun. In 753, a new pope arrived in Rome, Stephen II, and Stephen had a problem. A very large, very violent problem. Wearing armor and speaking Lombard. The Lombard kingdom in northern Italy had been pressing against the papal territories for years, and now the pressure had become something close to a siege. Stephen looked south toward the Byzantine emperor, who had once been the protector of Rome, and found nothing. Constantinople had its own catastrophes to manage. The old alliance had rusted away. So Stephen did something no pope had ever done. He crossed the Alps in winter. Picture that journey. an elderly man in papal robes, moving through mountain passes in the cold of 754, the wind cutting through every layer of wool and faith he possessed. His feet were likely numb before the first day was done. The path through the Great St. Bernard Pass was not a road in any comfortable sense. It was ice and rock, and the kind of silence that makes a man feel very small before God. Stephen made it. He arrived in the kingdom of the Franks, and when Pippin rode out to meet him, the Pope dismounted and prostrated himself on the frozen ground, begging for help. Pippin got off his horse. He helped the old man up, and in that gesture, something was sealed between the papacy and the Franks that would shape the next 1,000 years of European civilization. Stephen anointed Pippin again. This time, the ceremony went further. The Pope declared Pippin and his sons patricians of the Romans, protectors of the Holy See, defenders of the faith in the West. He also, in a moment whose significance it is hard to overstate, forbade the Franks from ever choosing a king from any dynasty other than Pippin's own. The Carolingian bloodline was now sacred, endorsed by the successor of Saint Peter himself. Try to take that away. Pippin marched into Italy twice, 754 and 756. The Lombards were formidable. They had held northern Italy for nearly 2 centuries, and they were not interested in retreating because a Frankish king had made promises to a pope. But Pippin was his father's son in the ways that counted. He moved quickly. He hit hard. The Lombard king Aistulf found himself cornered, then defeated, then forced to surrender territories he had seized from the papacy. And then Pippin did something that had no precedent in the history of Europe. He took those territories, the towns and lands stretching across central Italy, and he gave them not to himself, not to a Frankish lord, not back to the Byzantine emperor who technically claimed them. He gave them to the Pope. The donation of Pippin, a strip of land running across the Italian peninsula, from Ravenna to Rome, became the earthly domain of the papacy. The papal states were born. Think about what that meant. The Bishop of Rome was now also a territorial ruler, a king in everything but name. The church had land, revenue, soldiers, walls. It had a secular foundation for spiritual power, and it had a protector to the north who owed his crown, in the eyes of God and man, to the papacy's blessing. 2 institutions had looked at each other across a cold mountain pass and recognized something. They needed each other. The Pope needed a sword arm. Pippin needed divine legitimacy. Neither had what the other possessed. Together they had something the world had never seen before. A Christian kingdom in the West that was simultaneously a military power and a sacred order, where the authority of kings and the authority of the church reinforced each other like 2 hands pressing against opposite sides of the same do. Aliter, that door would hold for centuries. It would also produce centuries of conflict, of popes and kings pulling at the same crown, of excommunications and crusades and men dying in Italian mud over questions that began here in a monastery cell where a barber's blade caught the candlelight, and in a mountain pass where an old man lowered himself into the snow. Pippin returned to his kingdom. He governed. He administered. He held the Frankish church to account and pushed the borders of his realm outward with the same steady pressure his father had applied. He was not a visionary in the way that the son coming after him would be. He was something perhaps more essential. He was the man who made the ground solid enough to build on. He died in 768. He was perhaps 54 years old, The body gave out in Paris, at the Church of Saint Denis, the same basilica where Charles Martel lay, where the bones of Frankish greatness accumulated like sediment. He had ruled for 17 years as an anointed king, and in those 17 years he had transformed the Franks from a warrior people held together by a strong man's fist into the chosen protectors of the Roman Church. He had taken the hammer his father forged and wrapped it in gold. His son Charles would inherit that mission. He would inherit the alliance with Rome, the sacred anointing, the idea that the Franks were God's instrument in the West. But missions, as the coming years would prove, have a terrible tendency to expand. They grow past their original edges. They demand more than the men who received them ever imagined giving. And the man who picks up a mission at the beginning rarely sees, standing in the light of that first moment, what it will ask of him before the end. Charles was 26 years old when his father died. He stood at the threshold of something enormous. He did not yet know its shape. He has already crossed the Alps. That matters. Charles didn't deliberate at the threshold of Italy the way cautious men do. He moved in 773, when Pope Hadrian called for Frankish protection against the Lombard king Desiderius. Charles gathered his army and came south through the mountain passes like water, finding a crack in stone. Desiderius stands on the walls of Pavia and watches the plain fill up below him. Imagine that sight, the Frankish host spreading across the Italian lowland, campfires igniting one by one as dusk comes down, the smell of wood smoke and horse and 10,000 men settling in for a siege. Desiderius had ruled the Lombards for years. He had outmaneuvered popes and played Frankish politics with some skill. But he had never seen anything quite like this. He had never seen Charles. Here is what Charlemagne looked like, according to his court biographer Einhard, who knew him personally. 6 feet and 4 inches tall. In an age when most men stood 5.5 feet, he was a figure who entered a room and changed the geometry of it. Broad-shouldered, physically powerful, with a voice that Einhard described as surprisingly thin for a man of his size. He was literate in an age of illiteracy. He spoke Latin, understood Greek, studied rhetoric and astronomy. He laughed easily and ate simply. And in 40 years of military campaigning, he never lost a battle. Not once. Pavia held out for months. It didn't matter. When the city finally surrendered in 774, Charles walked through its gates and did something that would have seemed extraordinary to any man watching. He picked up the iron crown of the Lombards, the ancient symbol of their kingship, and placed it on his own head. Einhard later wrote that Charles did this almost as an afterthought, as if it were a minor administrative detail, as if absorbing an entire kingdom were the kind of thing a man does between breakfast and the morning's real work. That detail tells you everything about the man. He was not performing competence. He did not need to. The crown went on his head because of course it did. Because the logic of his position demanded it. Because he was the instrument of God's will in the West, and God's will, as Charles experienced it, had a very clear direction. Forward, always forward. He confirmed the papal states, expanded the territories Rome controlled, and bound the papacy to Frankish protection more tightly than Pippin ever had. Then he turned north, because the work in Italy, for now, was done, and there was always more work. The Saxons had been waiting 32 years. That is how long the Saxon Wars lasted, from 772 to 804, longer than most men of that era lived past adulthood. longer than some entire reigns. And they were not campaigns in the clean military sense. They were something uglier, a grinding, brutal, generation-consuming effort to break a people who did not want to be broken. The Saxons lived east of the Rhine, in the dense forests that Roman legions had once entered and never come back from. They were pagans, fierce, organized, stubbornly independent, and deeply attached to their gods and their ways. Charles came for their territory, but he also came for their souls, and that second ambition made the war something different from ordinary conquest. This wasn't just about land. It was about transformation, about forcing an entire people to become something they were not. In 772, Charles struck first. He marched into Saxon territory and destroyed the Irminsul. The Irminsul was the great sacred pillar of the Saxons, a massive wooden column that stood at the center of their religious world. It represented the axis of the universe in Saxon belief, the pillar holding up the sky, the point where earth and heaven met. Charles had it torn down and burned. The smoke rising from that fire was not just smoke, it was a message written in ash. Your gods are nothing. Your world will be remade. The Saxons responded the way people respond when you burn what they love. They fought back. They raided across the Rhine. They drove the Franks out of territory Charles had taken. They rose and fell and rose again, with a persistence that would have broken a lesser man's will entirely. But Charles was not a lesser man. He came back every year, or nearly every year, pushing deeper into Saxon territory, building fortresses, installing Frankish administrators, demanding baptism. He issued the Capitulary on the Saxons, a brutal legal document that made paganism punishable by death. Eating meat during Lent, death. Refusing baptism, death. Cremating the dead in the old Saxon way, death. The law did not offer the Saxons a choice between the old world and the new. It offered them a choice between the new world and the grave. Then came Verdun. 782. A Saxon nobleman named Widukind had led a major uprising. Frankish forces were ambushed and badly mauled at the Battle of Suntel Mountain. Charles was furious. He gathered the Saxon prisoners, 4,500 of them, and ordered them executed in a single day. 4,500 men. In one day. The killing was done at the banks of the Aller River. We do not know exactly how it was carried out. We do not know the sounds it made, though you can imagine the Aller running a different color by the time it was over. We know it happened. Einhard records it. The Royal Frankish Annals record it, the man who never lost a battle, the man who built schools and reformed the church, and wept when he read Augustine, ordered 4,500 people killed in an afternoon. How do you hold that? Charles was not a monster, in the way that lazy history sometimes needs its villains to be. He was something more complicated and more instructive. He was a man who believed, with total and unshakable conviction, that what he was doing was right, that the Saxons dying at Verdun were dying in service of a larger salvation, that the suffering he caused was the price of a Christian Europe that would endure for centuries. He was not wrong about the endurance. He was not entirely wrong about the price either. The Saxons kept fighting. Even after Verdun, even after Widukind finally accepted baptism in 785, with Charles himself standing as his godfather, there were more uprisings, more campaigns, more brutal suppression. The war ground on for another 19 years after Verdun. It ended not because the Saxons were annihilated, but because enough of them had been killed, relocated, and converted that resistance could no longer sustain itself. Charles had not just conquered Saxony. He had remade it from the inside out, the sweat of that effort, the dry-throated exhaustion of 3 decades of campaigning, the weight of iron mail worn season after season, was written into every Frankish soldier who survived it, and many didn't. But Charles was already fighting somewhere else. The Avars were a nomadic people who had built a formidable empire on the Hungarian plain. Fierce horsemen, skilled raiders, they had terrorized the eastern frontiers of Europe for 2 centuries. They stored their accumulated plunder in a series of massive earthwork enclosures called the Ring, a fortified complex that served as both treasury and stronghold. By 791, Charles turned his attention east. The Avar campaigns lasted from 791 to 796. They were different from the Saxon wars in one crucial way. The Avars, for all their military reputation, collapsed faster than anyone expected. Frankish forces drove deep into Avar territory with a speed and force that shattered Avar resistance before it could fully organize. And when the ring was finally breached, what the Franks found inside stopped them cold. The treasure was staggering. 15 enormous wagons, according to the sources, loaded with gold and silver, looted from 2 centuries of raiding across Europe. The sheer weight of it overwhelmed Frankish accounting. Einhard wrote that Charles sent the treasure back to Francia in a convoy that required dozens of oxen to pull. It was the greatest single haul of wealth the Frankish kingdom had ever seen, and Charles distributed it deliberately to the church, to his nobles, to allies across Europe, binding loyalty with gold the way a spider binds a web with silk. He reorganized the conquered Avar territories into a system of frontier provinces called marches. The Carolingian march system was an administrative innovation as significant as any military victory. Each march was governed by a military commander called a margrave, responsible for both defense and administration of the frontier zone. It was a system designed for permanence, not just occupation. Charles was not raiding. He was building. By 800, the shape of what he had made was visible to anyone who could read a map. Modern France, modern Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, much of Italy, the northern edge of Spain, where he had pushed the frontier against the Muslim emirate of Cordoba, more of Western Europe under one ruler than at any time since the Caesars sat in Rome. He had fought more than 50 military campaigns. He had converted hundreds of thousands of Saxons, Avars, and Lombards, some through persuasion, most through the blunter instruments of fire and sword. He had reformed the Frankish church, standardized weights and measures, promoted literacy at his court with an intensity that seemed almost desperate in a man surrounded by illiterates, and built a palace complex at Aachen that announced, in stone and marble and heated floors, that civilization had moved north. He was 52 years old. He had never stopped moving. And then Christmas morning came to Rome. The year was 800. Charles was in the city, ostensibly to deal with a crisis involving Pope Leo III, who'd been attacked by his enemies in the streets of Rome the previous year, his eyes gouged and his tongue cut, or so the story went, though he had recovered with suspicious completeness. Charles had come to restore order, to hold a synod, to be the protector of the church his grandfather and father had established the Franks as being. He walked into St. Peter's Basilica for Christmas Mass. The incense was thick in the cold air. The candles threw long shadows across the columns. He knelt at the altar to pray. Pope Leo stepped forward and placed a crown on his head. The congregation erupted. The assembled Romans cried out in acclamation. The old Roman formula, the words that had once greeted the emperors of the ancient world: Charles, most pious Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans. Long life and victory. The sound of it filled the basilica and spilled out into the Roman morning. And Charlemagne's face, according to the people who were there, showed something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something closer to displeasure. A tightening. A man who has just had something done to him that he did not ask for and is not sure he wanted. He later told Einhard directly. He said that had he known what the Pope intended that morning, he would never have entered the church, not on that day, not for that ceremony. Here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because either Charles was telling the truth, or he was performing, and both possibilities are extraordinary. If he was telling the truth, then the most powerful ruler in Western Europe had just been outmaneuvered by a pope he had come to protect. The crowning made it appear that imperial authority flowed from Rome, from the church, from the pope's hands. That was not how Charles saw his power. He had always held his authority as something received from God directly, not mediated through any bishop, however Roman. The crown on his head that morning was also, potentially, a collar. If he was performing, then the displeasure was theatre, calculated reassurance to the emperor in Constantinople, who would view a new Western emperor as a direct provocation. Diplomatic cover for a man who had spent decades building toward exactly this moment and needed plausible distance from the final step. Scholars have argued about this for 12 centuries. They have not resolved it. They will not. What we know is simpler and stranger than any argument. The man who tore down the Irminsul and burned it to ash. The man who ordered 4,500 prisoners killed in a single afternoon. The man who crossed the Alps as if mountains were a minor inconvenience and placed a crown on his own head almost without breaking stride. That man knelt in St. Peter's and let someone else do the crowning. Whether he wanted it or not, the world had a name for him now. Not just King of the Franks, not just King of the Lombards, Emperor of the Romans, and somewhere in the bitter cold outside the basilica, with the bells of Rome ringing across the hills, the question that would haunt the next 1,000 years of European history was already forming. Who gives power to a king, God, or the church that speaks in God's name? Charles walked out of St. Peter's with a crown on his head and no clean answer to that question. He never got one. Watch the hand move across the page. It does not scratch or smear. It does not hesitate. Each letter forms with a precision that feels almost mechanical, except that a human being is making it, bent over a slanted desk in a cold stone room, breathing carefully so as not to smudge the ink. The letters are small, rounded, clean, upper and lower case sitting together in a rhythm so natural it seems like it was always this way. It was not always this way. Someone invented it. What you are looking at is Carolingian minuscule, the writing system developed at the court of Charlemagne in the late 800s, refined by scholars he personally recruited and standardized across his empire by deliberate royal decree. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. Every lowercase letter you are reading right now, on this screen, in this book, on that sign across the street, descends directly from this moment, from this room, from these monks bent over their vellum in a scriptorium somewhere in the Frankish heartland, following a standard that one king decided mattered. The man who decided it mattered had also, less than a decade earlier, ordered 4,500 prisoners executed in a single afternoon at Verdun. That contradiction is not a footnote. It is the entire story, because when the wars slowed, when the borders of the empire stabilized into something that could be held rather than constantly expanded, Charlemagne turned the same ferocious energy that had driven him across the Rhine and over the Alps and into the Saxon forests toward something entirely different. He turned it toward the mind, and what he built there was, in its own way, as astonishing as anything he had ever taken by force. Aachen, that is where it happened, is permanent capital, chosen not for strategic position, but for the warm springs that rose from the ground there, which his aging body increasingly needed. He built his palace there, and within that palace complex, beginning around 796, he built something that had never existed in the Frankish world before, a school, not a monastery school for training priests, though those existed too, a court school, a palace school, a place where the greatest minds of the age gathered not to pray, but to think, to argue, to read, to teach. He called them from everywhere. Alcuin of York came from England, the finest scholar of the Latin West, a man who had spent his career at the Cathedral School in York, building one of the best libraries in Europe. Charlemagne wrote him letters. He persuaded him. Alcuin arrived at Aachen and became the intellectual center of the entire enterprise, the emperor's teacher, his theological sparring partner, the man who oversaw the standardization of Latin across the empire. He called Charlemagne David, after the warrior king of Israel who was also a poet. Charlemagne loved that. Theodulf came from the Iberian Peninsula, a Visigoth by birth, a bishop by appointment, a poet by nature. Paul the Deacon came from the Lombards, the same people Charlemagne had conquered, and wrote the history of his own defeated people with a dignity that the emperor respected enough to preserve. Einhard came later, a small man from the Frankish heartland who would become Charlemagne's biographer, the man whose written portrait of the emperor is still the closest thing we have to knowing what Charles actually felt. These men gathered at Aachen and formed what they called, with genuine pleasure, an academy. They gave each other classical nicknames. Alcuin was Horace. Theodulf was Pindar. Charlemagne himself was David. They wrote poems to each other. They debated theology over dinner. They argued about the nature of time and the proper calculation of Easter and the correct way to sing the liturgy. And Charlemagne sat among them, not above them, among them. He was by any account not a natural scholar. He had grown up in a world of horses and campaigns and the smell of smoke after a battle. He had not learned to read Latin with ease as a child, which was itself remarkable for a Frankish nobleman of his era. But he wanted it. Einhard writes that he kept writing tablets under his pillow at night so he could practice his letters in the dark, his large hand struggling to form shapes that came easily to men half his age. He never fully mastered the written hand, but he spoke Latin fluently. He understood Greek. He asked questions that kept his scholars up past the candles. Think about that image. The most powerful man in the Western world, lying in the dark, practicing his alphabet. In 789, more than a decade before the imperial coronation in Rome, Charlemagne issued a document called the Admonitio Generalis, a general admonition, a set of instructions sent to every corner of his kingdom. Among its commands was something that had never been mandated before at this scale: Every cathedral, every monastery, every major church across the Frankish realm was ordered to establish a school, not just for monks and clergy, for boys, for any boy who could be sent there. The goal was literacy, not universal literacy in the modern sense, but a broader, more deliberate cultivation of learning than anything the post-Roman West had attempted. He wanted priests who could actually read the scriptures they were reciting. He wanted administrators who could write accurate records. He wanted a civilization that could communicate with itself in a common language across thousands of miles of rough road and regional dialect. Latin became that language. Carolingian minuscule became its vehicle, and the copying programs began. Here is what that meant in practice. Monks in scriptoria across the empire were put to work reproducing texts. Classical texts, Roman texts, Virgil's poetry, Cicero's speeches, Suetonius's lives of the emperors, walks of natural history and rhetoric and philosophy that had survived in single copies in single monasteries, one fire away from permanent oblivion. Charlemagne's scholars identified them, sent for them, had them copied in the new, clean script, distributed them. Nearly 90% of the surviving classical Latin texts that we possess today exist because of copies made in Carolingian scriptoria during this period. 90%. Without this program, without this one king's decision that the past was worth preserving, the literature of Rome would be largely gone. We would be reading fragments. The smell in those rooms was ink and vellum, and tallow candles burning low. The sound was silence broken only by the scratch of quills and, occasionally, the murmured reading aloud that scribes used to check their work. Their hands ached. Their backs ached. The cold in winter seeped through the stone walls and stiffened their fingers. They did it anyway, because the emperor had said it mattered, and because some of them, perhaps most of them, genuinely believed it did. Then there was the chapel. The palace chapel at Aachen, begun around 796, was unlike anything the Franks had ever attempted to build. Charlemagne sent for plans, sent for craftsmen, sent for marble columns stripped from Roman ruins in Ravenna and Rome itself. The design was modeled on the church of San Vitale in Ravenna, the great Byzantine building that Justinian had raised 2.5 centuries earlier as a statement of imperial power. Charlemagne was making the same statement. Deliberately, consciously, he was saying that this was not a barbarian court, that the civilization seated at Aachen had a claim to the inheritance of Rome and Byzantium both. The octagonal dome, the mosaic floors, the columns of colored marble hauled hundreds of miles north, because no Frankish quarry could produce their equal. Every detail was a declaration. We belong in this history. We are not the end of something. We are the continuation. Stand inside it now, 12 centuries later, and you still feel it. The weight of the stone. The way the light falls through the upper windows onto the emperor's throne, still there, still in place. The simple marble chair from which he looked down at the altar where his scholars prayed. He sat there and he listened to them sing. Charlemagne died in January of 814. He was around 72 years old, which was extraordinary for a man of his era and his life. He had spent his final years increasingly confined to Aachen, his body finally surrendering to the decades of campaign and cold and physical punishment that no amount of warm spring water could fully undo. He had already crowned his son, Louis co-emperor, ensuring the succession in the Roman tradition he had so carefully studied and absorbed. Einhard wrote that at Louis's coronation, Charles wept, not for himself, He had lived fully, violently, enormously. He had nothing left to prove and perhaps knew it. He wept, Einhard suggests, for what he could see coming. He had built this empire through the force of a single, irreplaceable will. He had summoned scholars and built chapels and mandated schools and standardized script and preserved the literature of a dead civilization because he decided those things mattered. Because he was Charles. Because when Charles decided something mattered, it happened. Louis was not Charles, and the sons Louis would leave behind were not Louis. Will is not inheritable. Every empire learns this. The Carolingian Empire was about to learn it the hard way. He had built something extraordinary, a civilization of the mind laid over a foundation of conquest and blood. He had preserved the past and tried to shape the future, and now the future was arriving without him in it. The question was not whether the empire would fracture. It would. The question was how badly. The answer would be worse than anyone standing at his deathbed could have imagined. 120 ships moving upriver in broad daylight. The Seine in the spring of 845 did not roar or rage. It moved the way rivers always move, indifferent and slow, carrying the smell of mud and cold water and the season's first warmth, and riding that current, oars dipping in long, unhurried strokes, came the longships of a Danish chieftain named Ragnar. 120 of them. The men at the oars did not hide. They did not strike at night. They rowed toward Paris the way a man walks toward something he already owns. Nobody stopped them. The city had walls. The Franks had armies, or what remained of armies. But the emperor, Charles the Bald, grandson of the great Charlemagne, did not march to the riverbank. He did not send cavalry thundering down the Roman roads his grandfather had maintained with such ferocious pride. He sat. He waited. And then he paid. 7,000 pounds of silver. Danegeld, the Norse called it. Danegeld, the price of being left alone. 7,000 pounds. Think about that weight. Not just in silver, in meaning. This is not a story about Viking ferocity. The Northmen were formidable, yes, but they had been raiding Frankish coasts for decades by 845. What changed was not the Vikings. What changed was the empire they were raiding. To understand how a grandson of Charlemagne ends up buying his own capital's safety, you have to go back 30 years, back to the morning Louis the Pious buried his father and discovered he had inherited not a throne but a catastrophe waiting to happen. Louis was not a bad man. That is almost the saddest thing about him. He was genuinely pious, genuinely learned, genuinely committed to the Christian ideals his father had preached, but not always practiced. Where Charlemagne had accumulated concubines and ruled through sheer physical dominance, Louis kept one wife, reformed the monasteries, and tried to govern through law and principle. He was, by most measures, a better Christian than his father. He was a worse emperor. Charlemagne had held the empire together through the force of a personality so large it bent the world around it. Louis tried to hold it together through procedure, through inheritance plans, through documents. He drew up a careful settlement in 817 called the Ordinatio Imperii, dividing responsibilities among his sons while keeping the empire formally unified under his eldest, Lothair. It was reasonable. It was thoughtful. It was ignored almost immediately. The trouble started with a woman. It usually does when men need someone to blame. Louis's first wife died in 818. He remarried quickly, taking a young Frankish noblewoman named Judith of Bavaria. Beautiful, intelligent, politically sharp, she bore him a son in 823. They named him Charles, and the moment that child drew breath, the careful inheritance plan Louis had written began to unravel. Because Louis loved this new son, he carved out a portion of the empire for him, and his three older sons, Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German, watched their shares shrink and their father's attention drift toward this new, younger rival. The air at court changed. You could feel it. That particular tension of men who believe they have been cheated but cannot yet act on it. It smelled like patience rotting into resentment. By 830, patience ran out. Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German rose against their father. Not once, 3 times. 3 separate civil wars in 13 years, each one bleeding the empire a little more. Carolingian fighting Carolingian, Frankish cavalry riding against Frankish cavalry, the monasteries Charlemagne had built, the scriptoriums where monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, the schools where boys learned Latin and numbers and the shape of a unified Christian world. All of it rattled and cracked every time another army crossed another river to unseat another king. The worst moment came in 833. A field in Alsace near Colmar. Louis had raised an army. His sons had raised a larger one. The two forces camped across from each other and waited. And then, over the course of a single night, Louis's men began to slip away. Not in battle, not in defeat. They simply walked across to the other side, one by one, then in groups, then in floods, until Louis the Pious woke to find himself nearly alone in his own camp, surrounded by the silence of abandoned tents and the cold morning air and the knowledge that his own army had chosen his sons over him. History calls it the Field of Lies. Louis stood there in his armor and looked at what remained. He said nothing recorded. He did not need to. His sons imprisoned him. They forced him to perform a public penance, to confess his sins before an assembly of bishops, to surrender his sword and his belt, the symbols of his authority, and to stand before the church as a man who had failed. It was designed to break him. It nearly did. But Louis recovered. His sons quarreled among themselves, as sons will, and twice he was restored to power. He died in 840, still emperor, still technically in possession of the throne he had nearly lost 3 times. His hands shook at the end. His eyes had the particular flatness of a man who has seen too much disappointment to be surprised by any of it. And then his sons inherited the chaos he had failed to resolve. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 is one of those documents that looks dry on parchment and turns out to have shaped the world. 3 brothers, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, divided the empire into 3 roughly equal portions. Lothair took the middle strip, a long north to south corridor running from the Low Countries down through Burgundy and into Italy. Louis took the eastern portion, the Germanic heartland beyond the Rhine. Charles took the western portion, what would slowly, over centuries, become France. The borders they drew were not quite borders yet. They were more like wombs, lines cut through a body that had once been whole. But those lines hardened over generations. The people on each side of them began to speak differently, to pray differently, to think of themselves differently. The Eastern Kingdom developed into something that would eventually call itself Germany. The Western Kingdom developed into something that would eventually call itself France. The middle corridor, Lothair's kingdom, fragmented into smaller pieces that would fight over their identity for 1,000 years. Charlemagne had spent his life building one thing. His grandsons divided it into 3 in an afternoon, and into this fractured, exhausted, politically poisoned landscape, the longships came. The Viking raids of the 9th century were not random. They were strategic. The Northmen had scouts and informants, and a sophisticated understanding of where the wealth was, how the rivers ran, and how quickly any given lord could raise a defense force. They knew, perhaps better than the Franks themselves did, how badly the empire had degraded. They rode up the Seine, the Loire, the Rhine, the Scheldt. They sacked monasteries that had no walls. They burned river towns that had no garrisons. They carried off the illuminated manuscripts, the silver reliquaries, the altar crosses, everything Charlemagne had gathered and built and preserved with such ferocious intentionality, loaded into longships and rowed back to the sea. The smell of burning vellum is a particular kind of loss. Books don't just burn, they vanish. Monasteries that had taken decades to build. Scriptoriums where generations of monks had bent over candlelit pages, copying the literature of Rome and Greece and the early church, gone in an afternoon of Norse fire. The learning Charlemagne had worked so hard to preserve, the whole project of his palace school and his standardized script and his mandated education, bled away parchment by parchment, abbey by abbey, raid by raid. Charles the Bold tried. Credit him that. He built fortified bridges to block the rivers. He issued military reforms. He rode hard and campaigned often, and spent his treasury trying to plug gaps that kept reopening. But he was defending a coastline thousands of miles long, with an army built for pitched battle, not for the fast, brutal geometry of raid and retreat. Every time he marched to one river, the ships appeared on another. And so, in 845, he paid £7,000 of silver to make Ragnar's fleet turn around and go home. It worked in the narrow sense. Paris was not sacked that year, but the news spread. The Northmen learned something important on that spring morning on the Seine morning. The Franks could be made to pay. The price of raiding was low. The reward was high. The empire that had terrorized the known world under Charlemagne was now writing checks to make its enemies go away. More fleets came. More Danegeld followed. By the second half of the 9th century, the Carolingian world had a particular texture to it. Exhaustion, mostly. The smell of cold ash where abbeys had stood. The sound of bells that no longer rang because the bells had been taken. Local lords building local walls and making local deals because the emperor, whoever the emperor happened to be that decade, could not be counted on to arrive in time. Power was not disappearing. It was dispersing, fragmenting downward into the hands of counts and bishops and regional strongmen who protected their people because no one else would. This is how feudalism is born, not from theory, from necessity, from the silence where an empire used to be. The last Carolingian emperor, Charles the Fat, was deposed in 887. He had briefly reunited most of the empire's fragments. Briefly seemed like a restoration, and then failed catastrophically to defend Paris against another Viking siege. His own nobles turned on him. They chose a non-Carolingian, a capable military man named Odo, to be king of West Francia instead. Not because they hated the dynasty, because they needed someone who could fight. By 888, no member of the Carolingian line held the imperial title the empire Charlemagne had built in a single lifetime. through the force of one extraordinary, violent, complicated will, had been divided, subdivided, invaded, and finally abandoned in less than a century. The Frankish world had not ended, but it had been shattered into fragments, and those fragments were slowly, painfully, taking on new shapes. And somewhere in the wreckage, in the eastern portion of what had been Charlemagne's realm, in the forests between the Rhine and the Elbe, in the Saxon and Frankish territories that had bled each other for 100 years, something new was stirring. Not quite Frankish anymore, not Roman, not quite Christian in the old Carolingian imperial sense. Something harder, rougher, shaped by the specific pressures of invasion and division and survival. Something that would call itself, for the first time, German. The story of the Franks was ending. The story of Europe was just beginning. Picture him walking out. Christmas morning 800. The candles still burning in St. Peter's Basilica behind him. The smell of incense thick in the cold Roman air. His breath visible in the dark. He is 58 years old, heavy-shouldered, a man built for campaign tents and river crossings, and he has just been crowned Emperor of the Romans by a pope who needed him more than he needed the crown. He did not ask for this, or so he claimed. Walk with him for a moment into that Roman winter, feel the cold stone beneath his boots, the weight of a title that had not existed in the West for over 300 years. He will live 14 more years. He will spend them not on horseback, but at a desk, issuing capitularies, reforming monasteries, building schools, arguing theology with scholars he brought from the edges of the known world. He will never campaign at the scale he once did, the man who spent decades burning and converting his way across Europe will spend his final years trying to hold the thing he built together through law, through faith, through sheer force of administrative will. He will fail. Not completely, not immediately, but the empire will outlast him only in pieces. Now look at the pieces, because this is where most people stop looking. They see the collapse and call it the end. But collapse is not the same as erasure. A wall can fall and its stones remain, and the stones the Franks laid, across 4 centuries of war and faith and astonishing, improbable ambition. Those stones are still beneath your feet right now. Start with the most obvious thing. France, Germany, 2 of the largest nations in Europe. 2 of the founding powers of the modern world, both of them direct political descendants of the Frankish kingdoms. West Francia became France. East Francia became the nucleus of what would call itself, within a generation, Germany. The borders Charlemagne's grandsons drew at the Treaty of Verdun in 843 were not just lines on a map. They were the first rough outlines of a political geography that still exists. Every French passport, every German document carries a faint Frankish watermark, and then there is the Holy Roman Empire. When the Carolingian line faltered in the east, when the last Carolingian king of East Francia died in 911, the Saxon dukes elected a new king from among themselves. Within 50 years, in 962, the Saxon king Otto I received an imperial crown in Rome. The old Carolingian idea that a Frankish or Germanic king could be the secular arm of Latin Christendom, that the emperor and the pope together governed a unified Christian world. That idea did not die with the last Carolingian. It put on new clothes and kept walking. The Holy Roman Empire lasted in one form or another until 1806, 9 centuries. Think about that. The structure Charlemagne built in a single lifetime echoed forward for nearly 1,000 years, but the political legacy, as durable as it is, may not even be the most important thing. Go into any library in the world, open any book. Look at the letters on the page, the rounded, clear, elegant script you are reading right now. The alphabet that became the foundation of every typeface on every printed page in the Western world. That script has a name, Carolingian minuscule. It was developed in the scriptoria of Charlemagne's monasteries, standardized across his empire so that documents could be read and understood from one end of his realm to the other. Before Carolingian minuscule, Latin manuscripts were written in a chaos of regional scripts, cramped and difficult and nearly impossible to read across cultural boundaries. The monks of the Carolingian reform changed that. They created legibility, and from their careful hands, through the printing press, through 5 centuries of typography, the letters on this screen and on every page you have ever read descend in a direct line from a Frankish monastery in the 800s. The books themselves matter too. When the Roman world collapsed, classical learning did not disappear everywhere equally. It survived in monasteries, in fragments, in copies made by hands that understood they were preserving something irreplaceable. The Carolingian copying programs were systematic and deliberate. Charlemagne's court scholar, Alcuin, brought from the great monastery school at York in England, organized the effort. Monks across the empire copied Virgil and Cicero and Augustine and Jerome. Many of the oldest surviving manuscripts of classical Latin literature exist today only because a Carolingian monk sat in a cold scriptorium in the early 900s and copied them by candlelight. The Renaissance, 4 centuries later, reached back into those monastery libraries and pulled out the ancient world. The chain runs directly from Frankish monks to Florentine humanists to the modern university and the parish. This is the one almost no one talks about, but it may be the most consequential institution the Carolingians left behind. Before the Carolingian reforms, the Christian church in Western Europe was organized around monasteries and bishops in cities. The countryside, where almost everyone actually lived, was poorly served. Charlemagne mandated the building of local parish churches across his realm, each one serving a defined territory, each one funded by local tithes, each one a center of community life, record-keeping, education, and moral authority. The parish system organized rural European life for over 1,000 years. It shaped how people were born, married, buried, and remembered. It created the infrastructure of local community across the entire Western Church. You can still find its bones in every English village with an old stone church at its center. Latin itself. The Carolingian reform standardized Latin as the language of scholarship, law, and the church across Western Europe. Educated men from England to Bavaria to northern Spain could write to one another, read each other's work, argue theology and philosophy across enormous distances because they shared a written language. This was not accidental. It was policy, and it created the conditions for a unified intellectual culture that would eventually produce the great universities of the 12th century, the philosophical revolution of the High Middle Ages, and the shared scholarly world that made the scientific revolution possible. The word Europe itself, the term as a cultural concept, as a name for a shared civilizational sphere rather than just a geographical landmass, first appears in the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne's scholars used it. Alcuin used it in his letters. The idea that there was a thing called Europe, a community of Latin Christian peoples with shared values and shared obligations, was a Carolingian invention. Every time a modern politician speaks about European values, Every time a treaty invokes the shared heritage of Western civilization, they are reaching back, whether they know it or not, to the court of the man who smelled of horse and iron and wore a Frankish tunic under his imperial robes. And then there is the man himself. Charlemagne was canonized as a saint in 1165 by the antipope Paschal III at the request of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, who wanted a holy ancestor for political reasons. The canonization was theologically dubious. It did not matter. By that point, Charlemagne had already become something beyond a historical figure. He was a symbol. France claimed him as their founding king. Germany claimed him as their first emperor. Napoleon stood at his tomb and called him the great predecessor. The architects of the European Union, meeting in the ruins of a continent that had just destroyed itself twice in 30 years, invoked his name, the city of Aachen, where he built his palace and where he was buried, awards the Charlemagne Prize every year to individuals who advance the cause of European unity. The man has been dead for over 1,200 years. He is still being argued over. This is the final thing to hold on to. He was, by every Roman definition, a barbarian. His people had lived beyond the Rhine when Rome was at its height. They had sacked Roman cities and been sacked in turn. They had been dismissed for centuries as too rough, too violent, too uncivilized to matter. And yet, the schools that teach you, the alphabet you read with, the nations whose passports you carry, the idea that a ruler answers to a moral law higher than his own will, these are Frankish gifts, passed through Carolingian hands, built on the ruins of Rome by people who were told, for centuries, that Twents, were not civilized enough to matter. The barbarians did not destroy the ancient world. They carried it forward. And in doing so, without quite meaning to, they built the world we still inhabit today. On Christmas Day 800, a Germanic warlord from the Rhine frontier accepted a crown he claimed he did not want, in a city his ancestors had sacked, from a bishop whose authority derived from a church his grandfather had protected by force of arms. He walked back out into the cold. The candles burned behind him. The city was quiet. He was 58 years old, and he had perhaps no idea what he had just set in motion. But somewhere in the stones of that basilica, in the cold Roman air, in the scratch of a monk's pen in a distant scriptorium, the future was already being written, in an alphabet his people invented, in a language his scholars preserved, in a world his warriors against all odds had made possible.